So principle of mind-body integration. I think I was just searching for principles through OPA, like the keyword principle every time. And so that came up. I didn't check the wider context, but to me, that would seem like it's a part of integrity, right? Like to integrate my thoughts and my emotions, that's part of integrity. Would you agree?
It would include, it'd be part of integrity, yeah. Not exclusively, but it works very well with that, I'd say.
So what okay, so it's broader than integrity then.
It's more parallel, I guess I'd say, or horizontal integration. It's not strictly a virtue or anything like that, or a type of virtue or anything like that. But it is horizontal in the sense that it's the same level of abstraction. Like integrity can have to do with being consistent with both mind and body. And that's the way you can look at integrity.
Okay. I have trouble seeing seeing what the relative hierarchy of things are. I remember where this is from. I think it's from the reason section where he talks about emotions as product of ideas. So in that case, wouldn't it be more fundamental than virtues?
Could be. Now that you mention it, I think it could be because this is more like a principle about even how your mind functions.
Right.
Like, let alone what's virtuous. So you're probably right, actually.
Right. This is human nature.
Yeah. Yeah, it's probably more human nature, or it's the nature of man, which would be prior to just reason. Right. Reason is part of man's nature, but it's not all of man's nature.
Yes.
It's primary, but not the only one, but yeah.
I think we've talked about this, although I can't remember because it's something that comes up over and over for me. And maybe I'm just repeating it, but you can tell me. Concrete goals versus exploration for interest. I was thinking about, I was reading a book called Ultra Learning, and I see this come up over and over, and it's not just in this book, it's in many other books. Like, if you want to learn something, you've always got to ask yourself, what is my purpose? Like, what specific concrete thing do I want to accomplish? Like, for example, if I want to learn Mandarin Chinese, you might set a purpose of like, I want to be able to have a basic conversation with a stranger for 15 minutes. But I get that. It makes sense because then you can subordinate or relate or pick goals that are relevant to achieving that. And you have a direction and you have progress, right? You have a sense of progress. Yeah. But then there is also just this kind of like, I don't know if Aristotle, for example, started studying animals, and I don't know, maybe he did, but he wasn't like, well, this is going to help me achieve this and this specific concrete thing. I'm going to become a wealthy man. Like, there wasn't a specific, it was more just, I assume, just for the pure interest, like, let's see what happens. And so there's that kind of difference of, because I'm questioning this in relation to philosophy. I don't always often have, like, I've got a few purposes that are specific, but they're not very concrete. Like, it's not going to help me. For example, I will have $5,000 by the time I finish studying philosophy. Like, it's not like that. And so do you have any open-ended thoughts in relation to this topic of like setting study or research goals that have a specific concrete goal versus open-ended learning like Aristotle did when he dissected animals?
Concrete goals. I think a lot of that is, well, largely it is better to have concrete goals for on your way towards the bigger goals. That's just a fact of everyone, but it can vary to what extent that might be, to what extent you need to be very linear, and to what extent you can have some open-ended aspects of exploration. Mostly the way I've answered it with you is that you have to understand the wider context of life as your standard, as life as a standard of value, but then relate that to your particular unique qualities, like what skills you've developed so far, what interests you have individually, what makes you different in a fundamental way from other people. Those are what would vary your particular goals, and you could, depends how much further ahead you need. I would say it's important to have a framework of what you're trying to do. Maybe not goals per se. Like for me, it's more exploratory. And I have a goal of my framework of thinking, which is to understand how one creates their identity as through like creativity and things like that. That's really what drives a lot of things. For me, that includes free will as well. I mean, indirectly, like I like studying about computer science, or rather AI, and how that works, because I'm thinking in terms of, broadly speaking, I want to understand the function of, or how the human mind can function, but I can integrate that with other goals sometimes, or it's just part of, I could see some immediate study goals of different things, or it gets very, very broad, I guess, many different tangents, but usually any particular goal I'm working on usually has something concrete in mind. I think that usually helps for anyone, just something concrete.
But the example you gave of, I think it was, did you say something like the creation of identity through creativity and art?
Yeah, your self-identity.
Self-identity.
Yeah.
Self-identity defined through creativity and art.
Yeah.
Exploring, like, in a sense, that's open-ended, meaning an understanding what leads to it. Like that's like, there's no end point. It's constant. It's like a motion as opposed to a goal, right? Wouldn't you say so?
Exploratory could be.
Because so an example is Ayn Rand's goal of, she wanted to create the ideal man. And so obviously that's very broad, but it was still concrete, or sort of concrete, in the sense that there is an end point. Like, okay, John Galt, done. Now what do I do?
Yeah.
But then you contrast that with, but it doesn't seem like that's anyway, I just see there's that other possibility of open-ended, and I'm thinking about how to think about them.
I almost think that depends on the subject, actually. I can think of a lot of different ways to look at that. I'm not sure I can give a general answer.
Yes.
I think it depends on the field. As for Aristotle, I do know his dad was a physician and he died young. So Aristotle already had some inclination towards observation, but for whatever reason, he got into Plato's academy, I guess it was called. And he studied there for a while and he left it for some reason. I think he was expected to be promoted, but he wasn't. And he went to Macedonia. And some point in between, he started studying plants and animals and things like that. It's more later in his life, I think, actually, that he started doing those things. I don't know how late, but it was after he had already done philosophy a while.
Right.
He started really getting more empirical about his work. And he probably changed over time. So as an example, he's an example of somebody changing, I think. There isn't that much known about him, but yeah, he went that kind of progress, got close to the Macedonian royalty, eventually tutored Alexander the Great. And then Athenians got mad at him because they were worried that he was siding with the Macedonians and he was a political threat or something. And they wanted to kick him out of Athens. And he left and he settled somewhere else in Greece until he died. Well, he died the next year, actually. I almost wonder if he was killed, but he died the next year. He was kicked out of Athens.
I wonder if he did have a concrete goal, like it was something like study these plans to discover if there's some secret to the universe that can be used or something. I don't know.
I do wonder.
Know enough about him. Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to have to revisit this and think this over again.
Yeah.
So life is the ultimate value as a metric or standard or principle.
Yeah.
The pathway and process for me to judge like anything in the world in relation to life as an ultimate value is through virtues, right? And then the rest of the philosophy is there for me to judge virtues against, so to validate virtues. So when we talk about, okay, are you acting egoistically? Are you acting on the principle that life is your ultimate value? You just simply judge the action in relation to, does it contradict a virtue? And then the rest of the philosophy is there to validate virtues. That's it. Is that a good understanding?
So there's a validate. I'm not sure I'd phrase it that way. I mean, that's the right way to think about virtues. I think that they are a tool to judge correct behavior and for like successful flourishing in your life. Does everything serve to validate it? Can you clarify what you mean by that?
Yeah. So I was just thinking about, like, when you have a principle, an abstract principle, what's the process of, you can't hold every single thing in mind at the same time. And so there's got to be a process of integration until you get something like, okay, honesty. And now I judge this specific action in relation to the principle of honesty. And then the principle of honesty is the integration of many other generalizations before that, which maybe validate then isn't the right word, but those generalizations, those generalizations that honesty integrates are depending on the generalization, which is life is the ultimate value. I have it pretty vague in my head, but basically it's all this process of integration from these basic principles, like the principle of egoism or life is the ultimate value, are then combined or combine more observations to create another generalization, and then more generalizations, which are then integrated into virtues. And that's how you judge. So basically, when you're judging an action, the way you judge, let's say, am I acting on life is the ultimate value, or am I acting on the principle that everything has an identity? You don't necessarily go, okay, does this action have an identity? You simply relate it to the closest principle, which is much higher level, like a virtue. And it's like, maybe an example is, the virtues are like, you're getting in a car and you're just learning how to use the car. There are certain rules for you to, like, you got to turn the steering wheel this way. If you want to turn left, you got to turn it right. But you don't go and, like, if you want to get to your neighbor's house, you don't go automatically and, like, open up the engine and start playing around with the engine. All you do is you get in the car, so you're applying the virtues. The whole engine thing is just to make sure that you have a working car, which maybe every now and then you come back to. But the way you judge whether or not you're going to get somewhere, or how to get there, is simply by knowing how to use the car. So you just apply it to a virtue. So you don't have to hold a million things in mind. Does that make more sense? I don't know if that was.
Yeah, for the point of personal action in achieving ends, I'd say it all goes to serve life. I mean, that's not that. We have life that, you could say, integrates everything all together, and then that can be split up into fundamental values and the virtues associated with those.
Right.
And everything, a lot of things relate to that. But also, I mean, epistemology too goes to that function in a way that we judge quality of a epistemological theory related to what function it has for a life and living. In objectivism, it's not considered isolated from ethics. They're not the same thing, but they influence each other. That reason has a lot to do with the application of reason. In a way, you could say that although epistemology determines what would be true or not about ethics, it also can indicate what is true, therefore we need to use for our betterment of our life and our flourishing. It kind of reciprocates on each other.
What do you mean? I see the reciprocation, or I see the influence from one end. So, like, the epistemology affects the ethics, but I don't see the other way around. Like,
well, knowing that reason is man's means of survival implies that you need to find the epistemological principles that determine how to use reason.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. In reality, you may go both ways, you're saying, because you see, like, okay, people are doing this thing with their mind and they're managing to accomplish all these things and they're surviving better. So how are they doing it? What is the process? Like that?
Yes.
Got it. Okay.
I mean, epistemology is more fundamental, but it's not, you don't want to just strictly think of a hierarchy just always identical when you think about your life. Well, of course, ethics is what you're thinking of. Everything is subordinate to ethics, but broadly speaking, it's of course metaphysics and epistemology. It's not that your ethics determines reality or anything. That's just an aside sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. You know how I think Leonard said in knowledge, what was it, unity in epistemology and ethics in lecture 2, he said like Ayn Rand said she wouldn't have discovered the formulation that reason is man's primary means of survival if it wasn't for the Industrial Revolution. And then I was thinking like, what is it? Is it just because I had a look at Greek inventions, and, you know, Archimedes used maths to create and geometry to create a water screw. There was some guy who created a water clock. Heron of Alexandria, this guy created a vending machine. You put coins in like this little pot, and it releases water for you. And there's automatic doors as well that he created. The central heating, showers. Like, is it just that it wasn't obvious enough, like because most people, let's say, were surviving more hand to mouth, that you had to look really, really, really hard to find evidence of that? Do you think that's what it is?
I'm not totally sure. I mean, I think you're right that it almost sounds like it just wasn't enough, I guess she was saying, or at least not enough to determine its essential. It would seem that maybe she was thinking also of the necessity or the things that came just before the Industrial Revolution, like the American Revolution or Newton or principles of scientific reasoning, like Bacon's book on induction.
Right.
Different scientists. She might have been thinking of that too.
Right.
What led up to it as well. I'm not totally sure.
The integration of maths and physics, for example.
Yeah, that would make sense. I don't know what she meant entirely.
Yeah, okay.
But it seems most reasonable. That would be most reasonable, I think, to go that direction.
Okay. And then, you know how Aristotle advocates I think temperance, or like all his virtues are some kind of balance, like no extremes,
Yes.
everything in
Golden
the middle.
mean.
The golden mean. Do you think some of that is what was I going to say? Oh, I forget. Okay, we'll move on. I forgot my point on that. I was going to ask about his virtues. Well, maybe I'll ask you, what did he base that on? Like, where did he come up with mean, like everything has a mean?
I don't remember his line of reasoning to justify it, other than it seemed more intuitive that we get a sense that somebody can be stupid running into battle, like be rash that way, or be a coward, and you know that they're related. So, well, being somewhere in the middle is better than being one or the other.
Do you think that some of it could also be a reflection of that some values are simultaneous? Like, you can't eat all day, you can't just be with your friends all day, and you can't just work all day and do nothing else. There's like, I think there's that tent pole analogy where you've got different tent poles that have to hold up your tent, and so
Perhaps.
maybe it's capturing some of that.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
I'm not totally sure.
Yeah. Okay. And then I read about reductionism this is from Wikipedia. So, I mean, there's different definitions, so that's why it might be tricky. But if you read this passage, which is this little image, which is from a book on Da Vinci, it talks about his systems thinking, and he was like, would rail against what he called the abbreviators. And so it read to me exactly like what a description of a rationalist is. So I want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it is usually really pretty much is rationalism, a type of rationalism, I'd say.
Right.
Based on that characterization.
But when people use it in philosophy, that's not what they're referring to, right? Like, he's calling it reductionism, but
Right.
So it's confusing because then I looked up reductionism. I was like, oh, so there's already a thing about rationalism. But then I discovered that there's like 4 definitions, and
They
I don't.
usually mean people like rationalists, those who value reason heavily. They don't mean rationalists in the objectivist sense. Usually when you see that in outside of the context of objectivism, people usually mean somebody like Kant is one example, but rationalism could be anybody that deeply values reason, but over observation generally,
Oh,
which is
okay.
kind of applied, as opposed to empiricists, which is like Hume or Locke. Those are traditionally considered empiricists by people, and rationalists are
And
just the other kind.
and so when they say reductionist, is that a certain aspect of rationalists in the non-objectivist sense, or is that different?
Yeah, it's different because when they say reductionist, they mean, for example, that, well, the most easy example would be free will or denial of free will, that everything about the function of your mind is simply reduced to the functioning of more fundamental particles, in this case being, well, because neurons are what free will is, that's it. You can reduce everything to neurons, all of concepts reduced to neurons. They're nothing but neurons.
Okay.
It's just like an abstraction, like almost like an illusion to say that concepts are real if they really, they're just neurons firing. If you get really extreme, everything's just atoms bouncing. And that's all it is. Everything you see, just atoms bouncing.
Right.
It reduces to that, and that's that. Yeah.
That's the first definition, I think. There were like 4 more, but okay.
And I'd call that rationalist in the sense like you're looking purely at the definition of what something's built of, as if that justifies everything it does, which is grossly oversimplifying, which I would say is usually rationalistic.
Right. In the objectivist sense.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. All right, cool.
But so reductionism is usually, many people don't like it. Not even just objectivists, it's usually looked down upon a bit.
Right. Okay, so we got onto entities last time. Let's see. Would you say this formulation is correct? When I call something an entity, I'm just, everything in reality is actually one, right? Like the air, there's no reason why there's no metaphysical reason. We'll go with that. There's nothing out there that says this is that, it's only the fact that we have a mind and we think a certain way that there is even such a thing as entity. And so when we say entity, we're abstracting away some portion of reality that is distinct from some other. Would you say there's some fundamental distinction? Is that formulation reasonable?
Yes, I think so. I've had disagreements about it with some people, but also other people think it's perfectly great the way I say it. So about that formulation, I'd say that sounds appropriate to me, because it's not that there's some built-in hierarchy of what counts as more real than another. Rand did say that's not that atoms are less real than people, or balloons are more real than cells or something like that.
Yeah.
That in that sense it doesn't exist, but many of the boundaries we set are conceptual in the sense that the difference between an atom versus a cell is more conceptual distinction. It's not granted by reality per se. I mean, they have their nature as integrated objects or whatever you want to call them, but it's not that they're purely defined by reality as cells. It's your making a conceptual distinction of them as cells.
I can see how everything is this, like, if it weren't for our conceptual faculty, well, I don't even know if you can think this way, but because it kind of obliterates even thinking about it. But all of reality is just this big block. And so we divide it up mentally is what we're doing.
That's how I've understood it, yes.
Okay.
But
well,
it
it's
gets
interesting.
tricky, of course. But more or less, yeah.
And then I wonder, the reason I was trying to get at that is like, so if you look at the next section, I said, maybe what is not being said is that every entity has a fundamental, but if you're at the point of dividing up the block in some way, then you're only dividing it up when there is a fundamental, if that makes sense. Like, so, because I was getting confused about why can't something have multiple fundamentals, remember? And I'm still not clear on it.
Yeah.
But I was thinking maybe the solution here is that we're not saying everything has a fundamental. There is only everything. That's all there is. But when you divide, when you start carving up this big block that is reality, you're doing so according to what is, or you're looking for something that has a fundamental, like one fundamental, because that's how you carve up the block. Do you think I'm getting closer with that formulation?
Like whatever portion you've carved out, it has a nature according to, by its nature in reality. Like whatever you carved out does what it does because of what it is, not because you've decided that this is what it does, but whatever portion you've cut out of reality, whether that's even like, say, a tennis ball, you carve that out. There's certain characteristics about it when you look at it in isolation.
Right.
So it's not that you've invented yourself whatever you feel is to be their nature, but the nature is granted there. You just have to identify what about it you can hold in your mind and recognize and remember.
I wonder if there is I've often heard people talk about, like people who take drugs talk about like they felt like they're one with the universe.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's also from Eastern philosophy, but when they'll take like when they've tried DMT or ayahuasca, and they say the wording is always confusing, but I think it all essentially amounts to the same thing, which is they lose their ego and that everything becomes one. And I wonder if I don't know if that I wonder if there's a link, like what happens when your brain chemicals are changed and suddenly it obliterates all your concepts. Then you just feel that everything is one, which is, it's a strange, I don't know, this is speculation, but because I've heard that so often that I'm like, and now I've heard all these principles of like all knowledge is interrelated, the whole universe is one, actually is one big block, and we just carve it out with concepts. So yeah, if you melt away someone's concepts, then they just get the sensation of oneness.
It could be. I suspect that might be true. I mean, I think the only way to really know is just try yourself. I mean, I'm curious about it too. So maybe someday
I have tried, but I never
benefit.
had that. I never had that. I've never
Yeah.
had that experience, which a lot of people have. So
I wonder if it is determined partly by your prior philosophy already, whether you're was inclined to have the experience. You might need some sort of.
I think it's probably
inclination.
dose. I think it's dose of a chemical that you get to a point where it just obliterates. This is my description. I don't know if this is what happens, but it sounds like it just almost obliterates all your concepts, from what I've heard from people. So
that's what Buddhists believe, actually, like that there's just a reality, but they think making concepts is itself bad, and the ideal is to lose that sense of distinction of everything and only recognize that there's one of everything. There's a unity with existence, and that's it. There's no me, there's no you, there's no
that is
barrier
interesting.
between us.
It's interesting that so many different cultures have this view of everything being one then, and same with monotheism winning over monotheism, one theism, right, over pantheism. And and then even Hegel, he quotes, the truth is the whole. Interesting. Let's see what
it's just too bad Buddhists don't like concepts. They're anti-conceptual despite recognizing pretty well these epistemological principles.
What do you think what do you think they get right in a way that's beneficial today?
Well, that we by nature differentiate things, but maybe even integrate things, I wonder. But yeah, I think they're usually good about introspection. They usually have good, more than other philosophers. They can recognize what kind of mental states there are. And I think that's very interesting to take note of.
Whereas in Western philosophy, there's much less of like maybe a list of mental states recognized. Okay.
I mean, like Buddhists have like entire books of just like lists of concepts of emotions and mental states.
Oh, interesting. Okay, yeah. Okay, so but I'm sure there's a lot of there's so many books now on meditation. There's probably tons of work
Yes.
that's been done on integrating that knowledge into a modern framework of like introspection.
Yes.
Let me have a look at this next thing. Oh yeah, I was confused by this idea of like, if the truth is the whole and everything is one, then there's nothing specific. So we make it specific, or rather the way it impresses our consciousness, the block impresses our consciousness, we're able to make specific distinctions. I mean, this is confusing just thinking about this, but or another way to think about it is that there is one block and it is made up of specifics. I don't know. I'm just getting confused thinking about this, if I'm honest, but I don't know if you get enough of a drift to riff on that.
I would just clarify that things can be specific, like knowing if you did carve out a portion, whatever your view on the portion is, it still acts in a particular way. It's nothing about, you could have something specific in the sense that a portion of the whole acts in a particular way. And by focusing your perception on that portion, we can objectively determine at least that portion of reality.
Right. Do you know, it reminds me of when I read Kvasnik, and she said something, she gave a little introduction to Aristotle's method of categorization, and she explained his view. I think she said it was overthrown, I'm not sure, but his view of being able to neatly carve out components of reality like a chicken.
Yeah.
And so it reminds me of that.
Carving reality at the joints.
Yes,
I think
yeah,
that's
that
what
was
Plato
it.
said.
Oh, he said that. Okay, she said the same thing, carving reality at the joints. I came back to this mismatched hierarchies because I'm trying to get my head around this. My thinking of, so this was from lecture 2 on thought as integration from the art of thinking, and he gave the example of man on a desert island cannot get as much knowledge as he could in society. Therefore, man has 2 means of knowledge, reason and other people. And so my thinking on this now, since we last spoke, is that in order for me to be able to identify when there's a mismatch in hierarchy, I must already basically have all my generalizations validated. So I know I know what their context is and how many generalizations they integrate already. I must be at that point where that's in my thinking in order to even spot this. And then to break it down. So what do you think of that before I go on to break it down?
I think you're right that, I mean, you got to know what the principles are before you can come up with it, of course. So
because they're implicit, right? Like they're often implicit in the, okay.
It can only help to identify it explicitly. Is all I guess I'd say.
Okay, so I try to break this down. So I was like, all right, well, if I had these principles in mind, so reason as the foundation of all thought and division of labor, then I would translate mentally the argument to a man on a desert island acquires knowledge through reason, which is the foundation of all thought. But if he lives in society with a productive and efficient division of labor, then he is able to acquire much more knowledge through his reason. Therefore, man has 2 means of acquiring knowledge, reason and productive and efficient division of labor. The grammar there is intentionally wrong, which becomes nonsensical, but it's only when I've translated it into making the principles explicit that it's nonsensical.
Yeah.
That's how it's supposed to work, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they're not dividing them as a hierarchy. It's just there's one, there's another, rather than trying to integrate them. That's why it's an error.
Right. Okay, this idea of a definitional essential and an essential of a concrete, like a movie, book, or person, what is your view on the difference between a definitional essential and a definite and an essential of a concrete.
Where's that from? That
It's
phrase?
from Art of Thinking.
Okay. Definitional essential.
Like as in a essential of a concept versus an essential of a concrete, like a movie, a book, or a person.
It seems that essential of a concrete is more about, so to see what really would be the difference, other than a definition could be very context dependent, less so than the concrete itself. But that might be the opposite, actually, because concretes are more particular. Saying the essential of a concrete.
Right.
So I guess it's the concrete, the thing itself, the particular in reality. I would say the difference of that is the essential of a individual concrete is more context dependent because it's a very specific thing. Definitional is by nature more abstract.
Right.
You're just trying to capture what's essentially true of many concretes, not what's in particular special about an individual concrete of that kind. That's how I'm thinking of it.
Yeah, okay. So it's almost like there might be a definitional essential of a person, but then the essential of a person, if you can have one, I don't even know, but the essential of a person might be in this context, what differentiates this person from everyone else in this room, something like that.
That's what I would think he meant. That's how I'm understanding the phrasing.
I found this came up again, this abstracting away time measurements. Remember we spoke about it from Ito. So he said in the lecture on principles enable prediction about the future because they abstract away time measurements. And then in Ito, it's the axiomatic concepts that identify explicitly the omission of psychological time measurements, which is implicit in all other concepts. And so, first of all, I'm not clear why it's implicit in all other concepts, but then so there's certain abstractions we have that do this thing that makes time go away. That's what I understand. Like time is, I can't actually even think of a concept that doesn't abstract away time measurement. Like even chair. Why does a chair have to be a concept that's only present right now? Like there's chairs in the future, there's chairs in the past. So they also omit psychological time measurements.
Seems like they do have I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah. All right. Because that's what I was like, well, I was thinking about that. I thought everything omits the time measurements.
So the only two things go up a bit. Let me just. I don't know what times you would be referring to. That's omitted from anything else.
So this was from Philosophy Who Needs It. And I just I was reviewing some of this about philosophy and I was like, I think we discussed some of this. I was like, I wanted to break down, I was curious about the distinctions she was making. So some of it I know. We discussed disciplined process of thought yesterday, which I thought you gave a good, I like the way you put it, where it's I forgot, was it not deliberate, but what was the word you used? I was trying to differentiate it from purpose.
It did start with the D.
Yeah.
Committed.
Diligent. Diligent. You discussed it as like a kind of diligently sustained or a diligent process of thinking. Yes. So something like that. So so that's discipline. And then I was like, okay, well, let me differentiate all these unwarranted conclusions, false generalizations, and blah, 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 blah. I was just curious. So unwarranted conclusion for me would be to reach some mistaken conclusion by a bad method. So like, if I add, like the simple example that Peikoff used would be, if I add up a column of numbers and I make a mistake along the way, that's an example of some error in the method. It might be that I think that, for example, a process of thought consists of stringing words together. So I come to a conclusion like, I can give a real example might be, from my life would be, there's a thing called career capital. I have career capital in this industry. And so that means I should work in this industry. That would be a false conclusion. That would be like a bad method causing a false conclusion. So that's my unwarranted conclusion. That's an example I can think of.
Yeah, bad reasoning.
Yes.
Yeah, like,
well, bad reasoning leading to something that's wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then false generalization would be, so the one that comes to mind is someone who reads a book on, like, I know people who've done this, like they'll read a book on, I don't know, some American guy wrote a book, for example, about how to get wealthy, or like Rich Dad Poor Dad. I don't know, like, but there's principles in there, there's generalizations in there. And so they take that generalization, they extrapolate that generalization and apply it to their situation in Australia. But the problem is that maybe the generalization is based on, there's a certain context, and that context, in the example of this real estate investing, it might include, like, in the US, you have non-recourse loans, and that's essential. We don't have that in Australia. And so they falsely generalize from the principle. I don't know if that's a generalization, because the generalizations are given to them, but maybe they apply that generalization to Australia, but
yeah. I would really say it's a false.
Yeah, it's
false generalization. I think would be more like, say you see, you read one book by, I don't know, let's just say somebody reads one book by Nietzsche. They don't like it. They generalize all of Nietzsche's books are terrible. That'd be like a false generalization.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. That's
that way.
Much better and simpler example. I like it. Or even what we've been talking about in relation to certainty, like if you once saw a tree fall in the past and then you walk under a tree and you say, oh, maybe the tree will fall on me, that would be a false generalization.
Yeah.
Okay. Undefined contradictions. To me, I couldn't think of a concrete example, but it might be, all I could think of was if you hold two beliefs and you haven't analyzed them both in relation to each other, something like that. Like if you hold the belief that you should make your life as best as possible, but you also hold the belief that you should do as much as you can for other people, something like that. But you haven't taken them into both of them into consideration in relation to each other. That would be an example of an undefined contradiction?
Trying to think of a better example.
Yes, please.
It's more, what is contradictory? Trying to think of good examples. Where's a contradiction? I would think of it usually in terms of like extremism, in one definition, that being extreme is bad, but maybe that's not good either. I can't think of any good one.
Okay.
Maybe something in these examples I can think of is maybe within Christianity, they have to love like yourself to some extent, but you also need to love others almost more than yourself. And it can be contradictory. You don't even recognize it that way. You just see there's an issue you have with God or whatever. That would be something like that.
And then another example, this is from actually one of, I think, Ayn Rand's essays, but like the people who, let's say you complain and scream against rising prices and protest, but then the next day you want, like free university or something like that. I don't know. That would be an undefined contradiction.
Yeah, it could be. That's a better example, yeah.
Undigested slogan was easy for me because it's just basically anything you take. Yeah. I am a previous undigested slogan master. So Unidentified wishes, doubts, and fears would be just lack of introspection, right? That would be like Jim Taggart, just kind of not really knowing what he wants and hiding it from himself.
Yeah, I'd say so. Evasive or
Yeah.
trying to hide it.
Okay. All right, let's